The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood at his study window, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. The weight of the crown seemed heavier today, not just metaphorically but physically pressing down on his conscience. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged decades in just the few years since ascending to the throne, lines etched deeper by decisions no brother should ever have to make. The manila folder on his mahogany desk contained reports that would change everything. For months, Charles had hoped against hope that his younger brother Andrew would find a way to redeem himself, to show even the smallest sign of understanding about the gravity of his situation. But, as autumn leaves fell outside his window, so too had fallen his last shreds of patience with the Duke of York. Sarah Ferguson had called him just yesterday, her voice breaking as she pleaded for more time. "He's still your brother, Charles," she had whispered through tears. "He's still the little boy who used to follow you around the palace corridors, begging to join your games." But Charles knew that the innocent child Andrew once was had been buried beneath years of poor judgment, scandal, and an arrogance that seemed impervious to public shame or private counsel. The king's private secretary knocked softly before entering, carrying yet another stack of newspaper clippings. The headlines had grown increasingly harsh over the past weeks, with public opinion polls showing the monarchy's approval ratings plummeting to dangerous lows. "Your Majesty," the secretary said quietly, "the Prime Minister's office has called again. They're requesting an urgent meeting about the situation." Charles nodded grimly, knowing that political pressure was mounting from every direction. Parliament was growing restless, with several MPs openly questioning whether the royal family could continue to command respect while harboring someone whose associations had brought such disgrace to the crown. The Commonwealth nations were watching closely too, with some already beginning to distance themselves from anything connected to the scandal. Walking to his desk, Charles picked up a photograph tucked between the official documents. It showed him and Andrew as young boys, dressed in matching sailor suits, their faces bright with laughter as they chased each other through the palace gardens. Their mother, Queen Elizabeth II, stood in the background, her smile radiant as she watched her sons at play. How different things had been then, when the biggest worry was whether they would be late for tea with the Queen Mother. The transformation in Andrew over the years had been gradual but unmistakable. The confident naval officer who had served with distinction in the Falklands War had slowly given way to someone whose judgment seemed increasingly clouded by wealth, status, and questionable companions. Charles had watched helplessly as his brother made one poor choice after another, each decision seeming to push him further from the values their mother had tried to instill in them. The Jeffrey Epstein connection had been the final straw, though Charles had tried to give Andrew every possible chance to handle the situation with dignity. Instead, his brother had stumbled through that disastrous television interview, showing a shocking lack of empathy for victims and an even more shocking inability to understand how his words would be received by the public. The palace's damage control efforts had been futile. Andrew's own words had condemned him more thoroughly than any tabloid headline ever could. Late-night conversations between the brothers had grown increasingly tense over the past year. Charles had tried everything from gentle persuasion to firm demands, urging Andrew to step back from public life voluntarily, to seek counseling, to show some genuine remorse for the pain his associations had caused. But Andrew remained defiant, seemingly convinced that his royal blood should shield him from consequences that would destroy any ordinary person's life. The breaking point had come just a week ago, when Andrew had been spotted at an exclusive London club, laughing and drinking with friends as if the weight of scandal meant nothing to him. Photographers had captured images of him looking carefree and untroubled, images that appeared in newspapers beside stories about trafficking victims still seeking justice. The contrast was obscene, and Charles knew that his brother's inability to read the room had finally exhausted the family's limited capacity for protecting him. Princess Anne had been the most vocal in her criticism during the emergency family meeting called after those photographs surfaced. "He's not just embarrassing himself anymore," she had said with characteristic bluntness. "He's dragging all of us down with him, and, more importantly, he's damaging the institution that Mother spent 70 years building." Even Prince Edward, typically the most diplomatic of the siblings, had shaken his head in disappointment, admitting that Andrew's behavior had become impossible to defend. The conversation with William had been perhaps the most painful for Charles. His eldest son and heir had spoken with the measured tone of someone who had thought deeply about the monarchy's future, pointing out that younger generations would never accept a royal family that appeared to prioritize protecting its own over justice for victims. "Dad," William had said quietly, "if we're going to have any credibility left when my time comes, this has to end now." Catherine had been present during that conversation, her usual warmth replaced by a steely resolve that reminded Charles powerfully of his late mother. "The children ask me questions," she had said simply. "Questions about their uncle that I shouldn't have to deflect. They're old enough to understand that actions have consequences, and they're watching to see if that applies to everyone in our family." The reports from the palace's security team had added another layer of urgency to the situation. Andrew's continued residence at Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate, had become a magnet for protesters and unwanted attention. Photographers with telephoto lenses camped outside the gates daily, hoping to catch glimpses of the disgraced prince. The security costs alone were astronomical, but more troubling were the intelligence reports suggesting that some of the attention was coming from individuals with potentially dangerous intentions. Charles remembered his mother's final words of advice about Andrew, spoken during one of their last private conversations before her death. "He's lost his way," she had said sadly, her voice carrying the weight of a mother's love and a sovereign's responsibility. "But, sometimes, Charles, the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their choices." At the time, he had hoped things might still be salvaged, but now he understood the wisdom in her words. The king's thoughts were interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was his wife, Queen Camilla, her face showing the strain of the past difficult months. She had become his closest confidant in navigating this crisis, bringing both emotional support and clear-eyed practical wisdom to their private discussions. "Any word from Andrew?" she asked softly, settling into the chair across from his desk. Charles shook his head. "He's still refusing to take my calls. Sarah says he's convinced this will all blow over if he just waits long enough." The futility of that position was evident to everyone except Andrew himself, who seemed to exist in a bubble where royal privilege still trumped public accountability. Camilla reached across the desk and took his hand. "You know what has to be done," she said gently. "The question isn't whether, it's when." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Windsor, and Charles couldn't help but see them as symbolic of the tempest that was about to engulf his family. The decision he was contemplating would send shockwaves through the monarchy and probably cause irreparable damage to his relationship with his brother. But, as he looked again at the reports on his desk and thought about the institution he had sworn to protect, he knew there was no other choice. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, as King Charles III prepared to take the most painful action of his reign, knowing that sometimes love meant letting go, even when it broke your heart to do so. The emergency meeting convened in the Oak Room at Buckingham Palace on a grey Tuesday morning that seemed to match the somber mood hanging over the assembled family members. Charles had barely slept the night before, his mind racing through decades of memories with Andrew while simultaneously calculating the political and personal costs of what he was about to propose. The room itself, with its dark wood paneling and portraits of long-dead monarchs, seemed to weigh down on everyone present with the gravity of royal duty and historical precedent. Princess Anne arrived first, her face set in the determined expression that had carried her through countless royal obligations and personal challenges. She took her seat without ceremony, her practical nature evident in her understated clothing and the way she immediately began reviewing the documents that had been placed at each chair. Edward followed shortly after, looking uncomfortable but resolute, while Sophie, his wife, offered quiet nods of acknowledgement to the others as they settled in for what everyone knew would be a difficult conversation. William entered with Catherine at his side, their usual warmth tempered by the serious nature of the gathering. The future king carried himself with the bearing of someone who understood that decisions made today would echo through his own reign, while Catherine's presence offered a perspective grounded in the reality of public opinion and modern expectations. They had driven over from their home that morning in unusual silence, both lost in thoughts about how this family crisis was affecting not just the monarchy but their own children's understanding of duty and consequence. The last to arrive was Prince Edward's daughter, Lady Louise, now old enough to understand the implications of her uncle's behavior and mature enough to offer a voice representing the monarchy's future generation. Her inclusion had been Charles's decision, made after long consideration about who needed to be present for this historic moment. Louise's quiet intelligence and genuine concern for the family's reputation had made her an unexpected but valuable counselor during recent months. Charles began by distributing additional documents that had arrived overnight from the palace's legal team and security services. The reports painted an even more troubling picture than before, with evidence of Andrew's continued defiance and what appeared to be a complete disconnect from the severity of his situation. Intelligence sources suggested that foreign media outlets were preparing exposés that would bring renewed international attention to the scandal, while domestic polling showed public support for the monarchy continuing its downward spiral. I've asked you all here because what we decide today will define not just our family's future, but the future of the institution we've all sworn to serve, Charles began, his voice carrying the weight of sleepless nights and agonizing deliberation. Andrew has had every opportunity to handle this situation responsibly. Instead, he's chosen a path that threatens everything our mother worked to build and everything we hope to pass on to future generations. Anne's response was characteristically direct. She had spent the previous week reviewing historical precedents, consulting with constitutional experts, and speaking privately with trusted contacts in Parliament and the Commonwealth. Her research had uncovered similar situations throughout European royal history, providing both legal grounding and practical examples of how other monarchies had handled family members who had become liabilities to the institution. The precedent is clear, she said, spreading out copies of legal documents dating back centuries. When a member of the royal family becomes a threat to the monarchy's stability, swift action isn't just recommended, it's required. The crown's survival has always depended on its ability to place institutional needs above personal relationships. Her words were harsh but historically accurate, reflecting lessons learned through centuries of royal crises. William had prepared his own analysis focusing on public opinion and media coverage across different demographic groups. His team had conducted extensive research into how younger generations viewed the monarchy, and the results were sobering. Support among people under 40 had dropped to historic lows, with Andrew's scandal being cited as a primary factor in their growing Republican sympathies. We're not just losing the older generation's automatic deference, William explained, his charts and graphs painting a clear picture of the monarchy's declining relevance. We're failing to earn the respect of the people who will determine whether this institution survives into the next century. Every day we delay action is another day we're telling the public that royal blood matters more than accountability. Catherine's contribution focused on the practical implications for the working royals and their families. She had been documenting incidents where Andrew's presence or associations had created uncomfortable situations during official engagements, charity events, and international visits. Her perspective as someone who had married into the family offered unique insights into how the scandal was affecting day-to-day royal operations. The children's school friends asked questions, Catherine said quietly, her usual poise barely concealing her emotional investment in protecting her family. Questions about their uncle that forced them to either defend the indefensible or acknowledge that their family harbors someone whose behavior they can't understand or justify. That's not a burden any child should carry, royal or otherwise. Edward's position was perhaps the most conflicted, torn between family loyalty and institutional responsibility. As the youngest of the siblings, he had always looked up to Andrew, remembering him as the confident military officer who had served with distinction and pride. But even Edward could no longer ignore the evidence of his brother's spectacular fall from grace and his apparent inability to comprehend the damage he was causing. I keep hoping he'll come to his senses, Edward admitted, his voice heavy with disappointment and frustration. But every conversation I have with him convinces me that he's lost touch with reality. He genuinely believes he's done nothing wrong and that this will all disappear if he just ignores it long enough. That level of delusion isn't something we can work with. Lady Louise's perspective represented the voice of her generation, offering insights into how young people viewed the monarchy and what they expected from royal behavior. Her university friends had been remarkably frank in their assessments, providing her with a clear understanding of how the Andrew situation was damaging the royal family's reputation among the very people who would determine its future relevance. My friends don't understand why he's still living in a royal residence, Louise said with the bluntness of youth. They see it as the family protecting someone who doesn't deserve protection, and they're starting to question whether any of us deserve the privileges we have. That's a conversation we can't afford to lose. The discussion then turned to the practical mechanics of what Charles was proposing. Andrew's removal from Royal Lodge would require careful coordination between legal teams, security services, and media management specialists. The 30-room mansion had been Andrew's home for years, filled with personal possessions, memories, and the physical manifestations of a royal lifestyle that would be difficult to abandon. Charles had already consulted with the Crown Estate about the legal mechanisms required to terminate Andrew's lease on the property. The process would be complicated by the fact that Andrew had invested significant personal funds in renovations and maintenance, creating potential financial entanglements that would need to be resolved. However, legal experts had confirmed that the Crown retained ultimate authority over all royal residences, giving Charles the power to act decisively when institutional interests were at stake. Security considerations added another layer of complexity to the planning. Andrew's removal would need to be coordinated with protection officers, who would have to balance his personal safety against the reduced security arrangements appropriate for someone no longer representing the Crown. Intelligence services had already begun assessing potential threats and developing protocols for Andrew's life outside the protection of royal security. The emotional toll of the decision was evident on everyone present. These were people who had grown up together, shared countless family holidays and celebrations, and supported each other through personal tragedies and public challenges. The idea of effectively banishing one of their own went against every instinct of family loyalty and sibling protection that had been instilled in them from childhood. But, as the mourning wore on and the evidence was thoroughly reviewed, consensus began to emerge. The monarchy's survival required difficult choices, and protecting Andrew from the consequences of his behavior was no longer sustainable. The institution that had weathered wars, economic crises, and social upheaval could not survive a crisis of moral authority brought on by its own unwillingness to hold family members accountable. Charles concluded the meeting by outlining the timeline for action. Andrew would be given one final opportunity to leave Royal Lodge voluntarily, with a face-saving narrative about choosing to step back for the good of the family. If he refused, formal eviction proceedings would begin immediately, with all the public spectacle and media attention that such action would inevitably bring. As family members filed out of the Oak Room, the weight of what they had decided settled over them like a heavy cloak. They had chosen the institution over the individual, duty over family loyalty, and the future over the past. It was a decision that would define Charles's reign and set precedents for how future monarchs would handle similar crises. The gathering storm was about to break, and there would be no shelter for anyone caught in its path. The phone call came on a Wednesday evening as Charles sat in his private study at Highgrove, surrounded by papers related to upcoming state visits and Commonwealth obligations. Andrew's voice crackled through the secure line, filled with a defiance that Charles had hoped might have softened after their family's ultimatum. Instead, his brother's words confirmed the king's worst fears about how far Andrew had drifted from reality and responsibility. "You can't be serious about this, Charles." Andrew's voice carried the same entitled tone that had characterized his public statements throughout the scandal. "I'm a prince of the blood. I served this country with honor in the Falklands. You can't just toss me aside because some Americans have decided to rewrite history about people I barely knew." The disconnect between Andrew's self-perception and public reality was so vast that Charles felt a profound sadness settling over him as he listened. Charles had prepared carefully for this conversation, knowing it might be the last meaningful exchange between them for years to come. He had consulted with constitutional experts, reviewed similar situations in other European monarchies, and spent hours in prayer and reflection about his duties as both king and brother. But nothing had prepared him for the pain of hearing Andrew's complete rejection of responsibility and his apparent belief that royal privilege should shield him from consequences. "Andrew, this isn't about what I want," Charles replied, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning inside him. "This is about what the monarchy needs to survive. Your associations and your response to the questions they've raised have created a crisis that threatens everything our family has worked to build. I've given you every opportunity to handle this with dignity, but you've chosen a different path." The conversation deteriorated quickly from there, with Andrew launching into a litany of grievances about unfair treatment, media persecution, and what he saw as his family's betrayal of blood loyalty. His anger was palpable even through the phone line, mixed with a bewilderment that suggested he genuinely couldn't understand why his behavior was considered problematic. The man Charles was speaking with bore little resemblance to the brother he had grown up with, the naval officer who had once been the pride of their mother's heart. "Sarah's been crying for days," Andrew continued, his voice rising with emotion. "The girls are humiliated by all this publicity. You're destroying their lives for the sake of public opinion polls and newspaper headlines. Is that what mother would have wanted? Her sons turned against each other by a pack of wolves in the press?" Charles closed his eyes, feeling the weight of their mother's memory invoked in such a painful context. Queen Elizabeth II had indeed loved Andrew deeply, perhaps even more protectively than her other children because of his military service and the dangers he had faced. But Charles knew with certainty that she would never have allowed personal affection to compromise the institution she had dedicated her life to preserving and strengthening. "Mother understood duty," Charles said quietly. "She understood that being royal means accepting responsibility for your actions and their consequences. That's not what you've done, Andrew. That's not what you're doing now." The conversation was breaking his heart, but Charles knew that every moment of delay only made the inevitable outcome more damaging for everyone involved. The call ended with Andrew hanging up in anger, but not before delivering a final blow that would haunt Charles for months to come. "When this all comes out," Andrew had said, his voice cold with fury, "when people see how you've treated your own brother, they'll understand what kind of king you really are. Mother's legacy won't survive what you're about to do to this family." Charles sat in the gathering darkness of his study for a long time after the line went dead, contemplating the irony of Andrew's final words. The truth was exactly the opposite. Their mother's legacy would only survive if he was willing to make the hard decisions she would have made herself. Queen Elizabeth II had spent 70 years putting duty before personal preference, institution before family comfort. Charles was finally being called to make the same choice. The next morning brought news that forced Charles's hand completely. Andrew had been photographed leaving a London restaurant with Jeffrey Epstein's former business partner, apparently oblivious to how such an association would be perceived by an already skeptical public. The photographs appeared in every major newspaper, accompanied by editorials questioning whether the royal family had learned anything from the ongoing scandal. Charles's private secretary delivered the newspapers with barely concealed frustration. "Your Majesty, the Prime Minister's office has been calling since dawn. Parliament is in an uproar, and there are now open calls for a formal investigation into the prince's activities. The opposition is demanding answers about why he continues to enjoy royal privileges while associating with individuals connected to serious criminal activities." The political pressure had reached a critical mass that could no longer be ignored or managed through palace statements and private conversations. Charles understood that his government's stability was beginning to suffer because of his brother's behavior, and that international allies were starting to view the British monarchy as a liability rather than an asset in diplomatic relations. William called within the hour, his voice tense with barely controlled anger. "Dad, we can't wait any longer. These new photographs are everywhere, and my office is being bombarded with questions from Commonwealth leaders about whether the monarchy still stands for anything meaningful. The Governor-General of Australia called personally to express concerns about whether the Crown can maintain moral authority in their constitutional system." The conversation with William crystallized Charles's understanding of how far the damage had spread. This wasn't just about British public opinion anymore, it was about the monarchy's role in 16 Commonwealth realms and its relationships with dozens of other nations where royal associations carried diplomatic weight. Andrew's behavior was undermining Britain's soft power and damaging relationships that had taken decades to build. Catherine's voice joined the call, adding her perspective as someone who understood both media dynamics and public sentiment. "The schoolmothers are asking me direct questions now," she said, her usual diplomatic language replaced by frank honesty. "Questions about whether we support his behavior by continuing to house him in a royal residence. I can't keep deflecting these conversations, and I shouldn't have to." The final push came from an unexpected source, Princess Eugenie and Princess Beatrice, Andrew's own daughters, who requested a private meeting with their uncle the king. Charles met them at Clarence House on a grey Thursday afternoon, struck by how much they had matured under the pressure of their father's scandal and how thoughtfully they had considered the impossible position they found themselves in. Eugenie spoke for both sisters, her words careful but clear. "Uncle Charles, we love our father, but we can't defend his choices anymore. We've tried to support him privately while managing our own careers and families, but his behavior is affecting our children now. Our friends' children ask questions at school that we can't answer without either lying or acknowledging things that are too complicated for young minds to understand." Beatrice's contribution was even more painful for Charles to hear. "Dad doesn't seem to understand that his actions have consequences for all of us. He talks as if this is all happening to him, as if he's a victim of circumstances beyond his control. But we see the damage spreading to everyone who loves him, and we can't watch it continue indefinitely." The sisters had clearly discussed their position extensively and had come to the same conclusion that the rest of the family had reached. Andrew's presence at Royal Lodge had become untenable, and his continued defiance was making the situation worse for everyone involved. Their willingness to support their uncle's decision, despite their love for their father, provided Charles with the final confirmation he needed that action could no longer be delayed. Charles spent that evening walking alone through the gardens at Highgrove, reflecting on how family relationships that had seemed unbreakable could be shattered by poor judgment and stubborn pride. The brother he was about to exile bore little resemblance to the young man who had served with distinction in the South Atlantic, and Charles found himself grieving not just for their relationship but for the person Andrew had once been. The formal notice would be served the following Monday, giving Andrew one final weekend to consider voluntary compliance with the family's decision. Charles knew his brother well enough to predict that no such compliance would be forthcoming, but protocol and compassion demanded that the opportunity be offered. After that, there would be no turning back from a decision that would define the remainder of Charles's reign and establish precedents for how future monarchs would handle similar family crises. As Charles prepared for bed that night, he understood that he had reached the point of no return in his relationship with Andrew. The brother who had once been his closest companion in childhood adventures and royal duties would become, by necessity, a distant figure whose presence reminded everyone of the painful price of placing personal desires above institutional responsibility. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, but Charles knew that carrying it properly sometimes meant making choices that broke your heart while serving the greater good. The morning of the eviction dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of Royal Lodge as if nature itself was illuminating the end of an era. Charles had arrived at Windsor early, wanting to oversee the proceedings personally despite his staff's recommendations that he maintain distance from what promised to be a painful and potentially explosive confrontation. The king understood that this moment would define his reign's moral authority and establish precedents that would echo through generations of royal history. Andrew had barricaded himself inside Royal Lodge with Sarah Ferguson and a small team of lawyers, apparently believing that physical resistance could somehow override the legal and constitutional authority of the crown. Security cameras positioned around the estate captured images of closed curtains and locked gates, creating a siege atmosphere that played dramatically across television screens and newspaper front pages around the world. The legal team assembled by Charles included some of Britain's most respected constitutional experts, each carrying documents that left no doubt about the Crown's ultimate authority over royal residences. The eviction notice served that morning was accompanied by a comprehensive legal brief outlining centuries of precedent and the specific terms of Andrew's lease agreement, which had always been subject to the sovereign's discretion. Charles had hoped until the final moment that Andrew might choose dignity over defiance, perhaps emerging to make a statement acknowledging his mistakes and accepting responsibility for the consequences. Instead, his brother remained hidden behind locked doors, forcing the king to proceed with the most painful decision of his reign while photographers and television crews documented every moment for global consumption. The first sign of movement came just after noon, when Sarah Ferguson emerged from a side entrance looking haggard and defeated. She had aged visibly during the long months of scandal, her famous vitality dimmed by the stress of defending the indefensible and watching the man she had once married destroy everything they had built together. Her brief statement to the assembled media was a masterpiece of diplomatic pain, acknowledging the king's authority while expressing love for a man whose choices had made his position untenable. "The Duke of York has served his country with honor and distinction," Sarah said, her voice barely steady as cameras captured every emotion crossing her face. "But he understands that sometimes the greatest service to the crown requires personal sacrifice. We respect His Majesty's decision and will comply with his wishes." The words were carefully chosen to preserve whatever dignity remained while acknowledging the reality that resistance was futile. Andrew's emergence came 2 hours later, flanked by lawyers and looking like a man who had finally grasped the magnitude of his fall from grace. The confident swagger that had characterized his public appearances throughout the scandal was gone, replaced by the hollow expression of someone confronting consequences he had never truly believed would materialize. His brief statement was a grudging acknowledgement of defeat rather than any acceptance of responsibility. "I have been served with a legal notice requiring my departure from Royal Lodge," Andrews said, his voice flat and emotionless. "While I dispute the necessity of this action, I will comply with His Majesty's decision. I hope that time will prove that I have been treated unfairly, but I recognize that my position has become untenable." The words carried no hint of apology or recognition of the damage his behavior had caused to victims, to his family, or to the institution he had sworn to serve. Charles watched the proceedings from his study at Windsor Castle, surrounded by advisors who understood the historic nature of what was unfolding. The king's face showed the strain of a decision that had torn him apart personally while being absolutely necessary institutionally. This was not the triumph of justice that some media commentators would claim, but rather the tragic end of a relationship that had once been central to Charles's understanding of family and duty. The logistical challenges of Andrews' removal proved almost as complicated as the emotional ones. Royal Lodge contained decades of accumulated possessions, many with significant monetary or sentimental value, all of which needed to be catalogued and removed under the watchful eyes of security personnel and legal representatives. The process took most of the day, creating a steady stream of vans and trucks that carried away the physical remnants of Andrew's royal life. Princess Eugenie and Princess Beatrice arrived in the afternoon to help their father with the most personal items, their presence adding a layer of family tragedy to the legal proceedings. The sight of Andrew's daughters carefully packing photographs and mementos while their father stood silently watching became one of the most powerful images of the entire ordeal, humanizing a situation that many had viewed purely in terms of justice and institutional necessity. The immediate aftermath of Andrew's departure brought an unexpected calm to the royal family's operations. Staff members who had been walking on eggshells for months suddenly found themselves able to focus on positive royal activities rather than constantly managing crisis communications. The weight that had been pressing down on every family event and public engagement was finally lifted, allowing the working royals to engage with their duties without the constant shadow of scandal. Public reaction was swift and largely supportive, with polling data showing an immediate uptick in royal approval ratings and widespread agreement with Charles's decision. Editorial commentary praised the king's courage in putting institutional integrity above family loyalty, while constitutional experts noted the important precedent established for future situations where royal behavior threatened the monarchy's moral authority. International response was equally positive, with Commonwealth leaders expressing relief that the matter had been resolved decisively. The Governor-General of Canada issued a statement praising the Crown's commitment to accountability, while Australian officials noted that the swift action had preserved their constitutional system's integrity. Diplomatic relationships that had been strained by the ongoing scandal began to repair themselves almost immediately. Charles's first public appearance after Andrew's removal came 3 days later at a charity gala supporting victims of trafficking and abuse. His speech that evening was carefully crafted to acknowledge the pain of recent events while recommitting the monarchy to its fundamental values of service and responsibility. The king spoke directly about the importance of accountability and the obligation of those in positions of privilege to use their power responsibly. "The Crown has always stood for justice, compassion, and moral leadership," Charles said to an audience that included many people whose lives had been damaged by the kind of exploitation Andrew had been associated with. "When we fall short of those standards, we must be willing to acknowledge our failures and take corrective action, regardless of personal cost. That commitment is not negotiable, and it applies to everyone who serves this institution." The weeks following Andrew's exile brought a gradual healing process for the royal family, though relationships that had been damaged would never fully recover. Charles maintained minimal contact with his brother, limited to essential family matters and coordination through intermediaries. The easy intimacy that had once characterized their relationship was gone forever, replaced by the formal distance required by Andrew's new status outside the working monarchy. Andrew's new life unfolded in rented accommodation far from the royal estates, his security reduced to the minimum necessary for personal protection and his income limited to his naval pension and whatever private resources he could access. The dramatic change in circumstances was jarring for someone who had lived his entire adult life surrounded by royal privilege, but it also represented the reality that actions have consequences, even for princes. The precedent established by Charles's decision reverberated through royal houses across Europe, with other monarchies taking note of how decisively the British crown had acted when faced with a family member who threatened institutional integrity. Constitutional scholars began studying the case as an example of how traditional institutions could adapt to modern demands for accountability while preserving their essential functions. Sarah Ferguson's dignified handling of the situation earned widespread respect and helped her rebuild relationships with family members who had been strained by years of Andrew's scandals. Her continued support for various charitable causes and her careful avoidance of any criticism of the king's decision demonstrated a wisdom that contrasted sharply with her former husband's defiance and denial. As autumn turned to winter, Charles found himself reflecting on the personal cost of the decision that had saved his reign and, quite possibly, the monarchy itself. The brother he had once been so close to had become a stranger whose presence reminded everyone of the painful necessity of choosing duty over family loyalty. But the king also understood that his willingness to make that choice had strengthened the institution he had sworn to protect and preserved it for future generations. The empty halls of Royal Lodge stood as a monument to the consequences of unchecked privilege and poor judgment, while the renewed energy surrounding royal engagements demonstrated the power of decisive moral leadership. Charles had proven that the crown could police itself when necessary, establishing a standard of accountability that would define his reign and influence the monarchy's evolution for decades to come. In the end, the king's bold action had not destroyed the royal family but had saved it from destruction, proving that sometimes the greatest act of love is the willingness to enforce consequences that serve the greater good. The painful exile of Prince Andrew had become the defining moment of Charles's reign, demonstrating that even ancient institutions could adapt to modern moral demands without losing their essential character or purpose.